given that most of Chinese development is in the east and most Muslims are in the west of that country, contiguous to India, Pakistan, etc., my question is, what do you think is the possibility of non-state actors, separatist groups, etc., rising and causing individual hotspots, not unlike Kashmir or Chechnya, which would cause Chinese and India governments to have to directly intervene and divert resources in order to control them?
Now, not everybody on the panel has to answer, but whoever, Chaz, why don't you begin? And if you don't feel like answering a particular question, don't bother. We move on.
Well, I also referred, I think, to historic ties between the Islamic West and the East. Somebody mentioned Admiral Zheng He, the great Ming Dynasty admiral who visited the Indian Ocean basin and toured it multiple times. What you may not know, he was a eunuch. Now, before you snicker at that, you should realize that lots of places have, before Washington, D.C. even, have done very well at running empires through eunuchs. But Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans, and even the Chinese. Anyway, point is, you may not also know that Admiral Zheng's father was a Haji. He had been to Mecca on pilgrimage. He was a Muslim. He spoke Arabic. It was not a voyage of discovery so much as a voyage of reconnection that he made. There are no clear and concise and accurate estimates of the number of Muslims in China. The official estimate is somewhere a little over 20 million. That's registered people. The actual number is thought to be about 130 million. Beijing historically was one-third Muslim, which is why many of the restaurants are halal, meaning kosher. And same word, same concept, exactly the same, with very few minor differences. And China, of course, does contain a number of regions where the majority is Muslim. These include ethnic minority regions like Xinjiang. They also include Hui Chinese Muslim regions like Ningxia, which is a province in the northwest. So there are all these connections, and there are regular Hajj flights now from places like Kashgar to Mecca through Jeddah. And there is, in fact, a huge reconnection going on. And I can tell you that the Chinese, just as they are very vigilant to Internet-sponsored unrest, as you can see if you read today's news, are very vigilant in response to the possibility of Islamic extremism coming into their country. The formation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was in no small measure motivated by a desire to keep that under control. So it's an issue. Religious extremism, fundamentalism, religious maniacs of various sorts seems to be proliferating in every religion everywhere. And the Chinese do not want this to happen in China. So they will keep the screws on.
Dave.
A couple of comments. I completely agree with Chaz that Wahhabism is not going to be allowed inside China to take root. On the other hand, China as a target for Islamic extremists and terrorists because of growing energy relations, that's not at all impossible to conceive. In fact, I think it's likely that we're going to see some of this in coming years as China plays a larger role. China tends to be surprised when there's pushback against them in parts of the world that they go into. So when there's pushback in Zambia, when their oil programs get renegotiated more or less unilaterally in Angola, when there are some demonstrations in other parts of Africa that takes them by surprise, because their view is that they're just a power going out and not making demands on other people, and they just expect to be allowed to do this. But I think that it's not at all unlikely that as China's role in the world rises, particularly if you still have this phenomenon of Islamic extremism against their place in the world, that the target set could begin to shift from Western countries like the United States and Western Europe to rising powers, including China.
Just to add two
Please.
small things to that, I think it's not in the Chinese press, but there have been Chinese oil workers who have been kidnapped in Sudan and Somalia and Nigeria, and what you talked about is already becoming an issue. The second is in terms of Xinjiang, and I think if you look at the Russian model of Chechnya and say this is a way not to deal with an Islamic region, you could argue the same thing with China and Xinjiang. China has a problem not only with the potential of importing of Wahhabism, but radicalizing the local population because of repressive policies.
Thanks. All right, we'll take one more here, and then we'll go to the satellites. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Catherine King. I'm a school teacher at Hampden Academy. I heard Ambassador Pickering assert that the United States, if I understood him correctly, that the United States is the only country who can move the Arab-Israeli peace process forward to a solution. My question is, do we, given the apparent decline in our credibility internationally, do we functionally have the ability anymore to move that peace process to a resolution? And even if we do, assuming that we do, given the negativity and irritation that our intervention in foreign affairs apparently generates, is that something that we should burden share, I guess, if that's a verb, with other countries in the world?
Yeah. He certainly did say that he thought we are the ones that can solve it if it can be solved. Why don't we start with Chaz and see if anybody else wants this?
I think both I and Tom Pickering said, and I certainly agree with him, the United States is the only country as such that can both move the parties toward peace in the Middle East, or for that matter, block movement toward peace, as I fear we have done more than once in the past recent period. But I don't think, despite the grave damage we've done to our own reputation and influence internationally, that the block to effective American diplomacy in the Middle East is international. I think it's domestic. It's our own paralysis, schizophrenia, and inability to muster the will to act, to help establish Israel as an integral, respected, and accepted part of the Middle East that blocks us, not the international community. Were we to do what Tom suggested, which is to outline a final status for the Palestinians and a resolution of the Israeli disputes with the Palestinians and other Arab neighbors, I can assure you there would be a huge standing ovation internationally. People would like the United States to lead rather than veto and obstruct.
Other comments? Okay.
So I think the challenge here is that in the aftermath of these events in the Middle East, Tunisia, Egypt, and beyond, that I think from an American perspective, the peace process does become more necessary. The problem is on the ground, it becomes less likely. And I think that Tom Pickering is right that the U.S. would be the only player who could break that dichotomy, but I think it's just politically so challenging for all of the reasons that Chaz said, and I think there is going to be a new initiative by the Obama administration. What exactly they're going to do to try to get around and out of the box. Basically, they've I think they've so undermined the Palestinian negotiators by this combination of getting pretty out in front on settlements and then coming back. I mean, I think it's really, to my mind, it's really the biggest error in U.S. foreign policy that's been taken by the administration. Either they should have said, this is going to be very, very hard to do politically. We have to do it. If we're going to do it, we're going to stay out there and defend it, or they shouldn't have done it at all. And I fear now that it will be very, very hard, I think, particularly in the run-up to the election, to undertake the kinds of political initiatives that this would take. Very, very unlikely. Over the medium term here, Egypt may be a game changer in a positive direction. If indeed you have the Egyptian military remaining coherent and credible, you get a transition here to something that will certainly be more hostile to Israel, less friendly to the United States, but not a disaster. That might be the kind of a game changer that opens up the route for diplomacy. Unfortunately, I would be really surprised if this opening appeared before the 2012 presidential election.
Absolutely. Chaz, you have...
May I? Yes, I should say that while I agree we are the only country that could, as an individual actor, move or obstruct peace in the Israel-Palestine context, a single actor is not the only way that solutions can come about. Somebody asked, or several people asked, very good questions about the United Nations and its role. And in his remarks, Tom Pickering referred to what I would call, these are not his words, a future approach based on variable geometry internationally, variable geometry for solving problems. That is, building ad hoc coalitions, either within the UN framework or outside it, that can address all of the problems that we now have seen so terribly neglected, global problems that others have talked about, issues of peace and war like this one. So I think there are possibilities. If the United States continues, as we did the other day, to make the United Nations impotent and irrelevant or even injurious to the prospect of peace, the possibility is that people will organize outside the United Nations and, despite us, to impose their own views of what sort of peace there should be. And here I would note that resolution that we sponsored against 14 members of the Security Council, including our closest European allies, who spoke in favor of it quite forcefully, 14-1 vote in the Security Council, our veto, had 130 countries as sponsors. And this issue will move to the General Assembly in September. It's not over. And the United States is either on the train or we risk, like poor old Pauline, getting run over by it. And a final comment I would make is that it's not simply the world's loss of patience with us on this issue that is at issue, and I think the world and the region have lost patience with us on this issue. But there are things happening in the region that will alter Israeli calculuses. There has been no balance of power in the region since the Camp David Accords. Israel has had undisputed dominance, and that was the result of the Camp David Accords. That sustaining that has been the objective of our policy. But if, in fact, Egypt is more responsive to the popular will, if other countries also are more responsive to the popular will, then Israel will not be able to indulge itself in the sort of moral hazard it has. It will have to consider the risks of stiff-arming. It will have to consider the risks of seeking peace only through a drawn gun held against all its neighbors rather than through an agreement. And I think there are a lot of very smart and decent people in Israel, and a change in the strategic environment around that country that means that Israel again has to weigh risks, could see a change in behavior and an opening that I think, on the basis of many, many conversations and much travel in the Arab world, would be seized with alacrity by Arab leaders.
Which basically means that the overthrow of Mubarak could, in fact, have a very positive effect.
It could.
It could. Let's hope. All right, we go to, right? Yeah. What do students in China, Japan, and Vietnam learn about their respective histories? Does history instruction in these countries tend to foster regional understanding or nationalism? That's from Belfast.
Great question.
Yeah. Who wants to start that?
Well, I'll share with you a personal experience. My mother is Japanese. My father is American. Because I had a good Confucian mother, I went to Japanese school on weekends. I went to English language schools on weekdays. And I studied about World War II in my Japanese textbooks and in my American textbooks. And there was a marked difference in the way that certain things were portrayed. I then studied in Nanjing, where, of course, the Nanking Massacre happened. And you will find very little about that in Japanese textbooks, and you will find an inordinate amount about that in Chinese textbooks. If you talk to Vietnamese young people, they will, contrary to the idea that China is not an expansionist power, they will remind you that Vietnam was in fact colonized by China for 1,000 years. So I think there are many different histories that have not necessarily been integrated within Asia.
We're going to do Lanjin first and then go to Jazz.
Yes, there has been a long-standing dispute about textbooks, as we all know. I mean, but you see, the situation is this. Because of the political history of both countries, I'm talking about Japan and China, the different trajectory of their history, there is a reason for example, for Japan to change their high school textbook. Every couple of years you see this becoming an issue. But most Chinese, of course, they don't understand why Japanese even dare to do so. They don't understand the meaning of the Tokyo Tribunal, which they did not. That tribunal, unlike the Nuremberg, that did not put the Emperor Hirohito on trial. So there is no sense of collective guilt. The Japanese never think that war as being part of the collective, or the Germans, they bent backwards to apologize, sometimes even embarrassingly, about their deeds during that. But for China as well, because the communist history tried to eliminate other political factors who play also a very important role, like a KMT role and so on and so forth. So they try to make that history into a rather partial history. But that has been changing, because Chinese at least are debating very actively on whether we need to get rid of that kind of textbook writing. Or Japan still having some problem there, I think. Yes.
Banning. Yeah.
Just a brief anecdote to demonstrate the consequences of this educational, shall we say, disjuncture. I happened to be in South Korea, and I believe it was June of '92. I was doing a USIA speaking tour around, and that was the same time at that moment they passed the PKO bill in the Japanese Diet, allowing Japanese troops to participate in peacekeeping operations. And I was absolutely dumbfounded because several highly educated South Korean professors and everything said to me, "This is the first step to a new Japanese invasion of South Korea." And I thought, La La Land. What I mean, the fact was, up until that period, and I think Don Gregg tried to do a lot as ambassador, there was very little interchange between the Japanese and the Koreans. And this perception of where Japanese society was at that time was, I mean, we're sitting there berating the Japanese because they're too pacifist. They won't go out there and build their military and do the things we want to do. And here these Koreans think they're about ready to invade. I mean, it was really a problem. And I think there was an effort to bring more South Korean Japanese contact by the U.S. Embassy in South Korea and all. But this really has consequences of just misunderstanding where the country is today, not just the whole historical issue per se.
Yeah. Chaz, did you have anything?
I grew up in the Bahamas, I was educated in British schools initially about something called the American Rebellion. In that narrative, the British defense of the fort in Castine, which some of you probably know about, and which is now the subject of a brilliant book by Bernard Cornwell called The Fort, which I commend to your attention, was portrayed as a wonderful victory. I don't think that Saltonstall and Paul Revere and others saw it quite that way. When I came up here for further education, I learned that the rebellion was actually the war for independence. And somewhat later, I read a great writer about things in Maine, Kenneth Roberts, who wrote Oliver Wiswell, which I also commend to your attention, which demonstrates conclusively that it was a civil war. So it makes a difference how events are portrayed. And myths are among the most precious possessions of every country's nationalism. And East Asia, Asia in general, is no exception. And in this regard, just a final note, maps. I know we don't study geography in this country anymore, so nobody knows where anything is, but maps are important. If you go to Vietnam, just to take a different slant on the point that Hannah made, you go to Vietnam and you look in any classroom, you will see a map of Vietnam on the wall in which the landmass, I'm trying to figure out how this looks from your angle, probably fail, but anyway, the landmass is over here. And most of the space in the map is sea. That is those offshore islands that are disputed between China and Vietnam. So every kid in Vietnam has grown up believing that those islands are part of his or her country. In China, of course, the maps show a great sort of dotted line coming down into the South China Sea, enclosing all of that area. And if you talk to the Chinese, they will say, this line was drawn by the KMT, not us, not the communists. And the dotted line means that the land features within it belong to China. Well, the Vietnamese don't agree. Anyway, the point is that myth and map have tremendous influence on the way we see things and consider things, and there is a real problem with the contradictions between the way people are being taught in different countries, as that bears on disputes between them.
Maybe we should turn history over to the UN. From the balcony.
Hi, my name is Alexander Akhmatovich. I'm a history student at UMaine Orono. Calling into question how post-imperial we are, could you please comment on U.S.-China relations? Perhaps India can also be part of this, as they relate to our two major outstanding conflicts, certainly the most expensive ones, Iraq and Afghanistan, or AFPAC if you prefer.
Who wants to kick that one off? All right, go.
Yeah, I think first of all, the U.S.-China relationship vis-a-vis Afghanistan, this is the point I want to emphasize, that last year American side made an interesting proposal, something called the New Silk Road approach, try to grab Chinese attention by releasing what they called the unprecedented amount of the deposit of minerals they discovered. I'm sure they discovered a long time ago. They just chose that time to announce it. Try to attract Chinese investment. The idea is if Chinese can help Afghanistan build railways, highways, which Chinese are legendary for its speed of building these things. This is the main thing. I think that linking that U.S.-China relation to Afghanistan, the Chinese, I think they initially very much motivated. Then they decide, no, this is too risky. And also, there's an argument the longer Americans are stuck in Afghanistan, the better. So they withdraw. So they didn't participate.
And interesting, though, when that thing first came up, a lot of the reaction in the United States was, we're fighting this war so that the Chinese can exploit Afghan minerals.
Right.
Dave, then Chaz.
A couple of themes here. I think that there's been discussions between the U.S. and China on Afghanistan for a while under the assumption that there's very broad sharing of interest here in terms of threat of Islamic extremism. Pakistan is very important to China, very important to the United States. But that at the end of the day, what's striking to me is that we've been able to have a pretty good sort of analytic discussion with the Chinese about basic interests. But once you get any effort to move forward in any kind of coordinated way, not at all. Not at all. So, and I think that's especially true vis-a-vis Pakistan. I mean, the Chinese just aren't going to do very much in Afghanistan. They've got some investments. They're having trouble with those. But Pakistan, they keep a very, very independent policy towards Pakistan. India is extraordinarily upset with the United States over Afghanistan, what they see as an over-eagerness on the part of the United States to deal with the Pakistani government, which they see as totally feckless and very much opposed to their interests. And India is extremely concerned that the United States, and they're probably right, are planning an exit strategy from Afghanistan that they see as a major threat. So they are involved in their own relationships in Afghanistan, especially with the Northern Alliance, the tribal elements in the representing the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and others. That makes the Pakistanis extremely nervous and, again, further complicates U.S. efforts to build any kind of a regional diplomacy around Afghanistan. And this was what Tom was talking about earlier, or efforts to put those pieces together. They're extraordinarily challenging to put together.
Interesting to me is your last comment, Nanjin, that after all, maybe the Chinese really would like to see us stay there. And you also get the impression, remember about a year or two ago, the Russians announced that they would make absolutely sure that we could fly everything through Russia, no problem. I think they have an interest in seeing us stay there, too. Right. Chaz?
I'm not sure that I would attribute altruism to Moscow.
Absolutely.
Another way to put that is they've got their hand on, some part of our anatomy that... the question was about China, if I understood correctly, in West Asia in the post-imperial period, if there is such a thing. Chinese influence there is entirely economic, commercial. It is not political. China does not inspire others with its political system. It is not military. China has no power projection capability. I think there's no question whatsoever that in addition to being very happy to pick up a lot of oil concessions in Iraq after we began to leave, which the Chinese did, they very much want stability in the Persian Gulf. If Iraq has in fact been knocked out of any possibility of returning as a balance to Iran, as it was traditionally, if that was one of our great accomplishments, that we destroyed any possibility of a balance of power in the Persian Gulf, then I think the Chinese would prefer that we stay there, which I don't think is an act of kindness on their part particularly, in any sense. But they want stability, and if we're the only thing that can provide it, they will they will go along with that. But I think they, as we should, would prefer a balance of power in which foreign powers, the United States, China, and others, were offshore, helping the countries in the region to balance each other and achieve stability in that manner. And I wouldn't rule out the possibility that at some point in the future, and I don't think this is the next 10 years, but later, that China could be a helpful factor in empowering Iraq and the Gulf Arab states once again to balance Iran. It could not do that on its own. It could do that in partnership with India, with the United States and others, Europeans. And this is something that I suspect will be talked about the moment that I croak and don't have to worry about it. Final note is that in Afghanistan, as Dave suggested, there are very complex strategic games going on between India and Pakistan. The crucial issue in South Asia is not Afghanistan, actually it's Kashmir, which is a place in which India is conducting quite a brutal occupation. It has never managed to legitimize its incorporation of Kashmir into India with the local inhabitants. But derived from that, you have several things. First of all, India and Pakistan now have a nuclear standoff. It used to be that India had absolute military superiority over a much smaller, less capable Pakistan, but both sides drew out their nuclear six-shooters, and they're now in a standoff. Since they can't go at each other in a conventional war, they're going at each other asymmetrically. This means through terrorism in India, sponsored by Pakistan, against Indian targets in Afghanistan, sponsored by Pakistan, and it means, in the Indian case, by efforts to foment difficulties in Pakistan, Baluchistan, the border area, and it means there are 9 Indian offices now operating in Afghanistan, which the Pakistanis do not think are there to advance their interests. So, in this context, China very much sides with Pakistan, and it is therefore a silent player, not in the front room, but in the back room, that cannot be ignored. The final corollary of all this is that if, and I agree with Tom Pickering, Pakistan, Afghanistan is the way to see this, not the other way around. If some sort of consortium of neighbors is required to bring strategic denial to terrorism in the region, which is our objective. We want to deny it to terrorists with global reach. George Bush invented lots of things, misunderestimation and things like that. But the phrase terrorists with global reach was really quite brilliant. That nicely described the problem. And we want to deny them a revolutionary flophouse in which to train and reconstitute their energies in Afghanistan or Pakistan. That is an objective that all the neighbors ought to share, but we're going to have to deal with the India-Pakistan equation to get to such a concert.
Unfortunately, Pranam Bardhan had to leave early, so he's not on the panel, but I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about the possibility of solving the Kashmir problem, which seems even harder, frankly, than the Palestinian one. Any comments? All right, we'll give that a pass, and we'll go to the field. What do you have up there? We're going to be you next. Much of what was discussed this weekend was Council on Foreign Affairs centric. Could each of you list a publication or journal that gives a more expansive view of foreign affairs from a foreign perspective? Okay. If anybody has a foreign magazine, just raise your hand and shout it out.
Well, there's The Economist, if you want to call that a foreign magazine. It should be more focused on the U.S. than on Britain. And Asia Global.
Asia Global.
I think the difficulty with the question, I mean, it's an excellent question. The difficulty with the question is that there are only two countries at present that think globally. The United States, which is a global power,
China
has been for a long time. I mean a world power in the sense that nothing that happens anywhere in the world is without some implication for the United States, and no such problem can be addressed without an American acquiescence, if not contribution. The other country that thinks globally is China. Even though it does not have the status of a world power, it anticipates that it will be. And one of the reasons that Henry Kissinger was so charmed, he said 39 years ago tomorrow, when we arrived in Beijing, when he was so charmed by the Chinese, and Nixon was so charmed by the Chinese, was that even then they thought in global terms that American strategists found very, very congenial. We can talk to each other in a way that we were never able to talk even to our allies. Those allies have now got, and I think Tom correctly characterized the EU, they have now got very narrow and local visions. There's nobody looking at the world in quite the way that we do, which is why it's not easy to name a single publication. Although, frankly, I think our publications, like our strategy, are to a great extent running on autopilot and fossilized thinking, non-renewable energy, if you will, rather than breaking new ground or imaginatively re-examining some of the issues that we've been talking about.
We'll go there and then come down here. Yeah.
Dory Squibb from Camden. We seem to have a rising clamor in this country to lean more on China to follow the rules in international trade. One of the things I take home from this conference is to always ask the question, whose rules are these and where do they come from? But the rules that particularly come to mind involve currency, letting currency fluctuate freely, and intellectual property, paying for what you are going to profit by from someone else's thinking or patents or whatever. And possibly even the standards for how things are produced, that they be produced in a humane and safe way. I don't know if that's on the agenda yet, but I think it will be eventually. But
so the question.
The question is how can we resolve some of these rules questions, and what's the Chinese point of view on those?
Okay, well, let's start with John Lin.
Well, for international trade, I'm sure the rules now everybody accepts is the WTO as the arbiter, but again, we have to look at these rules, the history of the Americans, economy start as a protectionist to begin with. This is where Alexander Hamilton, Friedrich List, who are really, designed the American initial trade policy. Now you're moving into the era of free trade, and China, of course, try to abide by these rules as much as they can. Now, there's one area you mentioned. China seems to have a lot of problems. That's the intellectual property rights. But even on that issue, I think there is at least one myth here. That is, Chinese actually paid no attention to this. In other words, Chinese seem to be, set a policy, deliberate policy of neglect of protection. The reality is, China is the country spent most. I'm talking number one per capita on the internet property rights protection, according to the World Organization of the Intellectual Property Rights in Geneva. This is official statistics. Unfortunately, the question lay in the implementation. This is a state capacity issue where you actually tried to do so, then never really worked very well. At the local level, the customs and the official corruption, when you have Air Force using, military airport to smuggle gold, who is going to check? Or, those kind of very difficult issues. It's the implementation problem, I think.
Joanna.
Rules. Yes.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I would just add, I think that the international trade issues come up a lot when we are really focused on sort of domestic national interests, and it makes it a little bit harder to think about the bigger picture. One area that's been coming up a lot, particularly in the clean tech sphere, is protectionism. We've been pointing a lot of fingers at China about their domestic markets in wind energy and solar energy, and how foreign companies haven't been treated well there, have been and shut out of projects. But at the same time, we saw in late 2009, some of the first Chinese wind turbines were trying to be exported to Texas for a wind project there, and we immediately saw Capitol Hill say, we don't want this here. Why are we importing Chinese wind turbines? And a big backlash for that company, which they then were able to work through at the business level and come up with an agreement where you were going to have both Chinese technology and American jobs created through the project. So I think that those types of models are very possible and can happen, but often get neglected if we just sort of keep this protectionist tendency and not really look beyond that and look at our long-term strategy within these technologies. And I would just add that in the intellectual property rights realm, as China increasingly becomes an innovator and an inventor in its own right, as opposed to a purchaser or a replicator of technology, which is very much now where China's going, I think intellectual property is going to be increasingly important. Chinese companies now have much more at stake within their own domestic markets, and so you see the international property system really responding to that, I think, within China.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of points that there really aren't rules on currency and exchange rate regimes. So the WTO has a set of rules about protectionism and trade-related things. But basically, countries have very different currency regimes, exchange rate regimes, and that's historically, since the end of the gold standard, that's the world we've lived in. Now, the issue here is the relationship between currency regime and trade, and I think that's the tension here. But it's something that there's not a clear pathway forward on within the WTO. I think that on all of this, I completely agree with Joanna on IPR. As Chinese firms go out and become competitors in the global arena, that's when you will get big interest in implementing IPR. And that's what's happened with every other country in the world. They don't take IPR seriously until their own firms are threatened by IPR. And so that's almost inevitably will be the case with China. We have a big IPR issue with India as well, particularly in pharmaceuticals. And so this is not a China-specific issue. But again, I think right now, in terms of norm setting and system setting, rule setting, that the best we should be doing is a much more creative and advanced effort through the OECD mechanism to get China, India into these discussions, but to do so in a more open way than has been done in the past. The big risks out there are on future technologies, where I think China does see the ability to play a dominant market role in setting in the marketplace what will be standards that will give them competitive advantage.
Chaz, do you have a quick comment?
Very quick. Mention of the OECD is an illustration of a problem. China is not part of that.
Exactly.
One of the problems we face is that China has accepted the international rules as they are. It now wants to participate in their evolution, but we have not developed, in many cases, the mechanisms by which to consult Chinese and give them the feeling that they can accept, invest in, buy into the rules, the new rules. Yeah. I wanted to just make a very brief comment on standards, which I think is a much more important issue than many understand. Yeah. And I say this not least because NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, the heir to the old Bureau of Standards, is one of those institutions that's about to take a huge budget cut. When I arrived as ambassador in Saudi Arabia in 1989, I discovered that some 7 years before, the Saudi Arabian government had created something called the Saudi Arabian Standards Organization, which was writing standards in Arabic for the first time on industrial things and consumer goods. They asked if we would send some people to help them do this. We said rather characteristically, sure, if you'll pay. The Germans, the Singaporeans, the Japanese, the Swedes, and others understood what was at stake, and they sent experts for free. The Japanese, I should say at that time, we had a $500 million electric appliance market in Saudi Arabia for American products. Japanese rewrote the standards to require 127 volts and a 2-meter electric cord. Yep. Overnight, right. We lost our market. The Germans, we had a $15 million honey market in Saudi Arabia. And by the way, these standards start in Saudi Arabia. They end up going all over the place in the Arab world. So their effects are quite broad. The Germans came in, and noting that in Germany, unlike in the United States, where honey is produced in places with rather clear air, there's not much pollution in the honey. In Germany, the honey is full of soda ash. So they rewrote the standard to require soda ash in the honey. So I'm just saying, it's a rough game out there. And if we won't play by the rules and go on the field, we shouldn't be too surprised if we're sidelined.
Penny wise, pound foolish. All right, we got one here. Bob?
Quick comment and then a two-part question. I'll try to be very brief. In 2008, for the first time, the number of patents granted to Chinese patents granted to Chinese companies exceeded those granted to foreign companies. That in itself tells you IP enforcement is going to start happening big time in China. For Chaz, as you said, 39 years ago tomorrow, you and Nixon and Kissinger stepped off a plane in China. What were your expectations? What were the expectations of the U.S. and the surprises in the intervening 39 years versus how it's played out? And the second part, which may be related, is a month ago, Lawrence Solomon published an article in Foreign Post, China's Coming Fall. And the opening is, like the Soviet Union before it, much of China's supposed boom is illusory and just as likely to come crashing down. And it goes on to talk about corruption, environmental issues, and so on. Comments, please.
Two questions, not a two-part question. But anyway, Chaz, the first one was addressed at you, and then we'll go from there.
The U.S. opening to China was something that I had foreseen when I was suffering through Harvard Law School and trying to think of something to do other than practice law. And I looked at the world and I saw a bipolar conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union had enlisted China on its side, and in my view, this is the early 60s, lost it. I thought the Sino-Soviet split was real. Much of our intelligence community didn't agree at that time. Anyway, I determined that there was going to be a moment when the United States would have to reach out to try to enlist China in our contest, our global contest with the Soviet Union, And I decided I wanted to be there when that happened. And I was very, very lucky. I learned Chinese at exactly the right time. I did well enough in it. I'm essentially bilingual. I did well enough in it so that I was there. But the entire reason for this opening was strategic. On our side, there were two elements. The first I've just mentioned, which was the desire to ensure that China was acting in our favor in terms of the global balance, but also because we were very concerned about the vulnerability of China, that we bolstered China sufficiently so that the Soviet Union didn't knock it out of the game. There was a related matter, the war in Vietnam. We thought, mistakenly as it turned out, that by opening a relationship to China, we could add sufficient pressure on Hanoi to force a compromise that would preserve South Vietnam. That was the calculus. Nobody had any idea that the visit would end by catalyzing a revolution in China and a massive change in global affairs as a result of that.
Anyway, this is also about China. How prevalent is corruption at local and state levels in China, and is it on the increase or the decrease? Hannah, what's your experience?
I mean, absolutely. It is a huge, huge problem. The difficulty the central government now faces is that it is willing to, in many cases, address local corruption. There are very few cases in which central government corruption has been addressed. Now, having said that, last week the Minister of Railways was removed from his post for graft, and it brings up some very practical issues. China is building railroads all around the world. It turns out that possibly the Chinese railway minister was pocketing money for bad concrete that's used to lay the tracks. This is a very dangerous issue, not only for China, but for state-owned companies that are building things outside of China.
Yes, I think the real problem is not local level official corruption, rather than it is a structural problem, meaning it's a systematic grabbing of national wealth through power. Now, that I agree with Chaz about Deng Xiaoping's great achievement, but in China everything has yin and the yang. So Deng Xiaoping's real problem, actually the bad part of the legacy of Deng Xiaoping is the slogan he proposed to let some people get rich first. Now, it was considered pragmatism for a long time by Western analysts about Chinese economics. That's a wrong argument because the second part of Deng Xiaoping's statement is, let some people get rich first, then other people then can emulate, they can follow the example. It turns out people having power at the time become overnight millionaires. So this is something ordinary people can never copy and emulate. So we are creating a powerful interest group who have the largest share of nations. This is going to be, I just linking to the second question that's asked,
Whatever it was.
Yes. The second question is whether China is going to collapse. Now, I would say every decade there is one book or two books, sensational book, about coming collapse of China. Okay? Now, never come to pass, but this time, I'm talking about the next 10, 15 years, there is one possibility that China might have a major implosion, not because the bad management of macroeconomic policy management could be the social tension. And in most cases, the social tension coming from that systematic corruption.
Anybody else wants to shout it out? Chaz and then David.
An observation on corruption. There are two observations. First, the only people who claim about, who make a fuss about corruption are the ones who aren't getting their piece of it. And second, there are two kinds of corruption. One is facilitated. If you go and you try to move something into a building in New York, you're going to really objects to it because what it does is expedite, facilitate something that ought to happen. I don't like it, but there it is. The other kind is exploitative, unjust. There is a lot of the latter kind in China. People paying off officials to make unjust decisions, to take land from those who own it and reallocate it, and to exclude people from proper resolution of their disputes. And that is very, very dangerous, and that is why there are the 100,000 protests annually that Hannah mentioned. Final note, China still hasn't managed to separate government from business adequately. And when bureaucrats buy and sell things, people buy and sell bureaucrats. That's what we need to say.
Just a comment, bringing it a little bit to home, but the famous social scientist Albert Hirschman was driving through the Sumner Tunnel one day. There was a big traffic jam. He was in the right lane. The left lane began to move. He was thinking, this is great, you know, I'm going to be able to move soon. Time passed, the left lane kept going. He was thinking, God darn, what assholes in that left lane? And there's a lesson here on how social unrest begins to develop. It may have some relevance.
There are no microphones around. Does anybody want to raise their hand and ask one final question? Charlie, we'll give it to you. Last questions. Loudly.
Charlie Graham from Camden. I used to work in this theater.
We need you again.
One of the speakers who was going to come was Robert Kaplan, and because last year one of the issues brought up was an alleged Chinese-Indian competition in the Indian Ocean over port construction and maritime routes. I wanted to raise the question that I might have asked Mr. Kaplan. What is the nature of this, and to what extent is it something that we should be concerned about?
Any thoughts? Jazz? Hannah?
I've done a fair amount of reporting in Burma, which is perfectly situated between India and China. And there is certainly a battle going on between the two countries, not only for Burmese natural gas and oil, but also to build deep water ports for China so that Middle Eastern oil, instead of having to go through the Straits of Malacca down in Malaysia and all the way around, can now go from Western Burma in a pipeline to Yunnan province in the southwest. And I think for not only for Burma, but for other countries in Southeast Asia, this is becoming an increasingly important issue.
I think Bob Kaplan has emerged as an apostle of the Indian Ocean as the central geopolitical feature of the world to come. I had hoped he was going to be here because I don't agree with him at all about that. And some of the off-site supporting evidence, ports you referred to, for example, an alleged Chinese strategy to construct a, quote, string of pearls, unquote, is demonstrably nonsense. The phrase string of pearls was originated by Booz Allen Hamilton in a Defense Department study. It is not a Chinese term. It does not represent anything other than the conjecture by a Washington Beltway bandit about what China might do in the future. But so far, the allegation includes the existence of Chinese naval facilities in the Cocoa Islands off Burma. Everybody who has gone there to look has found no evidence of that. There is a port in Pakistan, Gwadar, in Baluchistan, which the Pakistanis originally asked the United States to build. We didn't have the money, and U.S.-Pakistan relations were too troubled to come up with it. They turned to China. China did build it. It will become the port for a railway system that runs through Pakistan to Kandahar in Afghanistan, tying Afghanistan more firmly to Pakistan and competing with an Indian port in Iran, an Indian-built port in Iran that's trying to take Afghanistan away from Pakistan. So it does have strategic significance, but not for China. It doesn't connect to China, and having driven the highway over the Karakoram to Pakistan from China, I can tell you it never will. The port was built by Chinese construction companies. It's been under the management of the Port of Singapore, which is a big international port manager. That contract was up for competition again in November last year. I don't know who's got it. The third port or issue is called Hambantota, and it is a port in Sri Lanka that, for reasons you might be able to understand, is being built in the president's hometown. It is a container port and a transshipment port which lacks the depth for warships and which is clearly related to a free trade zone and industrial estate arrangement. Again, it's being built by the Chinese with Chinese funding, but there is no reason to believe that it is a naval facility. What you have here is Indian disinformation, in part, Indian anxiety, sincere in nature, and the fertile imagination of the Indian mind at work on a neighbor that until recently they really had made very little effort to understand. There are very few research institutes, Chinese-speaking Indian scholars, or the like in India. And the less you know about a people and a place, the freer you are to project your own fantasies onto it. A lot of this, so far, is just that. Maybe in the future, there will be some reason for India and China to clash in this Indian Ocean region, but so far it hasn't happened. And the Chinese Indian Ocean Fleet that the Indian Navy is told it must prepare to fight not only does not exist, but may never exist.
In short, Chaz, we didn't miss Bob Kaplan. We've got two closing comments. Dave Gordon is under. What's going on here? I mean, as I look at this, I see two or three things going on. The first is that the Chinese are developing a hedge strategy on energy because they're very nervous about their vulnerability to the United States on flow of energy. So this is the hedge strategy. It's about the U.S. It's not about India. But secondly, is that the prime Chinese strategy is, as Chaz said the other night, is still to count on the United States to provide support and military protection of the sea lines of communication. If you look at the investments that are being made in the Chinese Navy, they're all about contingencies having to do with Taiwan. They're all about the theme I talked about yesterday of making it harder and more time-consuming for the U.S. to get in the game. So the two things are going on. I think one is the Indians are very concerned. They see a rise in China. They misinterpret things. But the second thing that's going on very, very much here is inter-service rivalry in India. And it's the Indian Navy now, again, in this moment when the Air Force and the Army, because of the challenge from Pakistan and Afghanistan, are really seen as the focal point, the Indian Navy, that has a proud tradition, is saying, we want ours too. This is the pathway they've chosen to get it. So Bob is talking, I'm afraid, too much to Indian naval guys.
Sounds familiar. I think threat analysis is the mightiest weapon of military budget justification.
Banning, and then Marjan's going to close it up.
Just a quick comment. I think over the years, the Indians have looked at China as their great rival, great threat, and just kind of how they measure themselves, the strategically important factors. For the Chinese over the years, India was a strategic dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. They simply didn't take them seriously. China was concerned about the Soviet Union and Russia and the West, and China didn't take India as a very serious power, at least not as an equal rival. And I think there is this whole thing from the Indians going on that sort of shapes these perceptions. And I had an Indian admiral last March say to me, Chinese have no right to have their navy in the Indian Ocean at all. It shouldn't be there. I didn't have the quickness to ask him, well, you mean the Indian Navy, then of course shouldn't go up into these China Seas and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's a kind of a weirdness going on there, I think.
This is an important point. I'm sorry to stretch the whole thing out a little bit, but Nanjin, you have a final comment, and then we're going to, don't leave, because Bob Hirsch is going to tell you what we're doing next year.
Yes, about Robert Kaplan. I just quote myself. At the time he wrote that piece, I had a commentary, my regular editorial in the South China Morning Post, which we're writing regularly in Hong Kong. I think the fundamental problem with his argument is he assumed China has a Mahan who already sought out the more comprehensive strategy of a Chinese Navy and so on. That, of course, is not absurd. I don't think Chinese has a coherent naval strategic thinker or naval strategy to begin with. My argument would be we do not even need Mahan. It's impossible for China to challenge what American fantasy of continued ownership of Western Pacific in the last 60 years. But what China really needs is another type of strategic thinker. That is Alfred Tirpitz, which is the founder of the German Navy in late 19th century. That is how to strike a balance when you have a limited coastline. Now, China is not a two-ocean country. We have a limited coastline, basically land-based, but then what exactly is the function of the Navy in the future? This is what Admiral Tirpitz, who lived the same time as Mahan, they both developed, on both sides of the Atlantic, the naval school, so-called naval theater. So I think there is also interesting part when David talked about inter-service rivalry here. When we heard a lot of fantasy about Chinese organization, Chinese Navy, don't forget we have inter-service rivalry. Very serious one. Because under President Hu Jintao, I venture to say this is the only service that gets a flavor. There are political reasons, personality reasons, I don't have time to explain it, but Navy was really the most favored service so far. We don't even know the next leader what he will do.
We're going to have to cut it off here. Hold your applause until the end. And I want to say one thing. I have never heard such a quiet audience. Not a throat clearing. It's been wonderful the last 15 minutes. You all deserve a lot of applause. Thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you next year again.